June 20th, 1998. A Saturday morning in Kipfenberg, a small Bavarian town in southern Germany. The sun was rising over orchards and fields, the kind of quiet rural landscape that looked like it belonged on a postcard. A neighbor was walking past the house of Conrad Schumann when something caught his eye. In the orchard behind the house, hanging from a tree limb, was a body. Conrad Schumann was 56 years old when he took his own life that morning. He hanged himself in his own garden, among the fruit trees he had planted and tended for years. His wife Kunigunde found him there shortly after. There was no note, no explanation, just the terrible finality of a rope and a tree, and a man who had decided he could no longer continue living. The man who died that morning in Bavaria had once been the most famous defector in the world. 37 years earlier, on August 15th, 1961, a photograph had captured him at age 19, leaping over barbed wire from East Berlin into West Berlin. The image, snapped by photographer Peter Leibing, became instantly iconic. It was called "Leap into Freedom," and it appeared on the front pages of newspapers around the world. Conrad Schumann became a symbol of freedom, of courage, of choosing the West over communist tyranny. But freedom had not brought him peace. For 37 years after that famous jump, Conrad Schumann lived in West Germany and then unified Germany, working ordinary jobs, raising a family, living a quiet life. And for 37 years, he was haunted by what he had left behind. The depression that finally drove him to suicide in 1998 had its roots in that single moment in 1961 when he made a split-second decision that would define and ultimately destroy his life. This is the story of the East German border guard who fled after one glance at West Berlin. It's a story about a photograph that captured a moment but couldn't capture the decades of regret and homesickness that followed. It's about what happens when someone becomes a symbol for something larger than themselves and can never escape that symbolic weight. And it's about the terrible truth that sometimes freedom isn't enough to overcome the pain of exile from everything and everyone you've ever known. Hans Conrad Schumann was born on March 28, 1942, in Leudewitz, a small village near Schopau in Saxony in what was then Nazi Germany. He came into the world during the darkest period of the Second World War, when Germany was still powerful, but beginning to face the reality of eventual defeat. His early childhood was defined by war, by shortages, by the constant anxiety that pervaded life in Germany during those final years of Nazi rule. He was only 3 years old when the war ended in May 1945. Germany collapsed in total defeat, occupied by the victorious Allies who divided the country into zones of control. Saxony, where Conrad's family lived, fell into the Soviet zone of occupation. The Soviets were harsh occupiers, extracting reparations from a devastated country, dismantling factories to ship machinery back to the Soviet Union, imposing communist control over every aspect of life. Conrad's family were not intellectuals or dissidents. His father worked as a locksmith, an ordinary skilled tradesman trying to support his family in impossibly difficult circumstances. The post-war years in Soviet-occupied Germany were years of hunger and hardship. Food was scarce. Housing was damaged or destroyed. The economy was in ruins, but the Soviets were consolidating their control, establishing what would become the German Democratic Republic, a communist satellite state completely subordinate to Moscow. Conrad grew up in this world. He knew nothing else. The division of Germany into East and West, communist and capitalist, Soviet and American zones became permanent. In 1949, the German Democratic Republic was officially established in the Soviet zone, while the Federal Republic of Germany was created in the Western zones. Two German states, each claiming to represent the true Germany, each developing in completely different directions. Young Conrad's childhood was that of an ordinary East German boy. He attended school where the curriculum emphasized Marxist-Leninism and taught that the GDR represented the workers' paradise, while West Germany remained trapped in capitalist exploitation. He joined the Pioneers, the communist youth organization that all children were expected to join. He learned to view the world through the ideological lens that the party provided. But Conrad was not particularly political. He was not an intellectual or an ideologue. He was a country boy from Saxony who liked working with his hands and being outdoors. After finishing his basic schooling, he trained as a sheep herder, working in the agricultural sector that was so important to East Germany's struggling economy. He was good at the work, comfortable with animals and rural life, content in the simple routines of tending flocks in the Saxon countryside. In 1960, at age 18, Conrad was conscripted into the National People's Army, the military force of East Germany. Military service was compulsory for young men in the GDR, part of the state's comprehensive control over its citizens' lives. Conrad had no choice in the matter. He was assigned to serve as a border guard, part of the forces responsible for maintaining control over the border between East and West Germany. This was considered a position of trust. Not every conscript was assigned to border duty. The authorities selected young men they believed were politically reliable, men who wouldn't be tempted to defect, men who would actually shoot anyone trying to escape to the West. Conrad, with his rural background and apparent political passivity, seemed like a safe choice. He had family in East Germany, connections that would presumably keep him loyal. He had never expressed any interest in or curiosity about the West. The training was rigorous and ideological. Conrad and the other border guards were taught that they were protecting the workers and peasant state from Western aggression and infiltration. They were told that West Germany was a fascist state controlled by the same Nazi elements who had started World War II, that West Germans lived in poverty and exploitation, that the Berlin Wall, when it came, would be an anti-fascist protective rampart, defending peace and socialism. Anyone trying to flee from east to west was a traitor, possibly a spy, certainly an enemy of the people. Border guards had not just the right but the duty to shoot anyone attempting to cross illegally. Conrad absorbed this training without apparent resistance. He was 19 years old, unquestioning, doing what he was told. He had never been to West Berlin. He had never seen the other side of the border he was supposed to defend. He only knew what he had been taught, and nothing in his life had given him reason to question those teachings. In early August 1961, the political situation in Berlin reached a crisis point. Berlin had been divided into 4 occupation zones after the war, with the Soviet sector in the east and American, British, and French sectors in the west. But unlike the border between East and West Germany, which had been sealed and fortified since the early 1950s, the border between East and West Berlin remained relatively open. People could move between sectors, and increasingly, East Germans were using West Berlin as an escape route to the West. The numbers were devastating for the East German government. Thousands of people were fleeing every week, voting with their feet against the communist system. These weren't just ordinary citizens. Doctors, engineers, teachers, skilled workers, the educated elite of East German society were abandoning the country. The GDR was hemorrhaging its most valuable human capital. On August 12, 1961, a single day, approximately 2,400 East Germans fled to the west through Berlin. It was unsustainable. The communist government had to act or face complete collapse. On the night of August the 12th to 13th, 1961, East German police and military units sealed the border. It happened suddenly in the early morning hours. Barbed wire was strung along the sector boundaries. Concrete posts were installed. Streets were torn up. The subway connections between East and West were severed. When Berliners woke up on the morning of Sunday, August 13th, they found their city divided by barriers that had appeared overnight. It was called Barbed Wire Sunday, the day the Berlin Wall began. Conrad Schumann was one of the border guards deployed to maintain the new barriers. On August 15, 1961, just 2 days after the initial sealing of the border, Conrad was assigned to guard duty at the corner of Bernauer Strasse and Bernauer Strasse in East Berlin. The wall at that point was still just coils of barbed wire about 3 feet high, nothing like the concrete barrier it would eventually become. But behind Conrad stood armed soldiers and police, watching both the sector boundary and the guards themselves. The message was clear. Keep people in. Don't let anyone cross. And don't even think about crossing yourself. Conrad stood at his post in the late afternoon. He was wearing the uniform of the East German People's Police, the Volkspolizei. He carried a weapon. His orders were explicit. On the other side of the barbed wire, just yards away, was West Berlin, the French sector. A different world, though Conrad had never seen it. West Berliners had gathered on their side of the new barrier, watching the guards, watching the East German workers who were reinforcing the barbed wire and beginning to install more permanent barriers. Some West Berliners were shouting encouragement to the guards. "Come over, jump, you can make it." They held out cigarettes and chocolate as enticements. The divide was so narrow that Conrad could see their faces clearly, could hear every word they said. Conrad looked across the barbed wire into West Berlin. He saw ordinary people, civilians, standing freely on the street. He saw buildings that looked prosperous, undamaged by war. He saw cars, more cars than he had ever seen in one place in East Berlin. He saw shop windows with goods displayed. He saw a world that looked nothing like what he had been taught the West would look like. Behind him, Conrad was acutely aware of his commanding officers and the other guards watching him. He had been at this post for hours. He was hot in his uniform, his feet hurt from standing. And something was happening inside him, some crisis of conviction he couldn't quite articulate even to himself. The people on the western side were still calling to him. "Jump! Come over! You can make it! It's just barbed wire. Just jump." Conrad looked at the barbed wire. It was only 3 feet high. He could clear it easily. He looked at West Berlin. It was right there, yards away. He looked back toward East Berlin, toward his commanders, toward everything he had ever known. And in a moment that lasted seconds but would define the rest of his life, Conrad Schumann made his decision. He threw his weapon to the ground, he ran toward the barbed wire, and he jumped. Peter Leibing, a 19-year-old West German photographer working for the German news agency Conti Press, had been stationed near that corner of Bernauer Strasse all day. He had heard rumors that border guards might defect. He had his camera ready. When Conrad started running, Leibing raised his camera and fired off a sequence of shots. The shutter clicked at exactly the moment Conrad was in midair over the barbed wire, his body horizontal, legs tucked, in a perfect athletic leap. The photograph captured a single, frozen moment. Conrad in his uniform, his face tense with concentration or fear or determination, the barbed wire below him, West Berlin ahead of him, East Berlin behind him. Everything in that image was transition, movement, transformation. A man caught between two worlds in the act of crossing from one to the other. Conrad landed on the western side. West Berlin police immediately surrounded him, hustling him into a waiting vehicle before East German forces could respond. Within minutes, Conrad Schumann was being debriefed by Western authorities, given civilian clothes, assigned a place to stay. Within hours, he was being celebrated as a hero, the brave guard who had chosen freedom over tyranny. Peter Leibing's photograph was transmitted around the world that same day. It appeared on the front page of newspapers across Europe and America. "Leap into freedom," they called it. The image became iconic almost immediately, one of those rare photographs that perfectly captures a historical moment and transforms it into symbol. Conrad Schumann, 19 years old, became famous internationally overnight. But Conrad himself was in shock. The decision to jump had been so sudden, so impulsive, that he had barely thought through the consequences. Now, sitting in a West Berlin apartment in civilian clothes, the full weight of what he had done began to sink in. He had abandoned his post. He had fled the East German military. He was a deserter, a defector, a traitor to the state he had been raised to serve. More devastating, he had left behind everyone he knew. His parents were still in Chopau. His friends were all in the East. He had a girlfriend named Gerda, a young woman he had been seeing, who was now completely beyond his reach. He couldn't contact any of them. Any attempt to reach out would put them in danger. In East Germany, the families of defectors faced terrible consequences: harassment, loss of jobs, denied educational opportunities, constant surveillance by the Stasi. His parents would suffer because of what he had done. The East German government moved quickly to contain the propaganda damage. They couldn't acknowledge that a border guard had voluntarily fled because that would validate Western claims that even those assigned to defend the wall didn't believe in the system. So they released a statement claiming that Conrad Schumann had been kidnapped by Western agents, forcibly pulled across the border against his will. It was a transparent lie, but it was the lie the GDR needed to tell itself and its citizens. Conrad was initially housed in a refugee center in West Berlin along with hundreds of other recent escapees. The Western authorities were overwhelmed by the flood of people who had managed to flee before and immediately after the wall's construction. Conrad underwent extensive debriefing. Intelligence officers wanted to know everything about East German border security procedures, about the training he had received, about the orders guards had been given. Conrad answered their questions as best he could, though he was just a 19-year-old conscript, not privy to high-level policy or planning. Within weeks, arrangements were made to resettle Conrad in West Germany. He couldn't stay in West Berlin, which remained an isolated island surrounded by East German territory. He was sent to Bavaria, to southern West Germany, as far from the border as possible. There he was helped to find work and begin building a new life. The photograph followed him everywhere. Leap into Freedom was reprinted constantly. It won awards. It became one of the defining images of the Cold War. Whenever newspapers or magazines ran stories about the Berlin Wall or East German refugees, they used Peter Leibing's photograph of Conrad Schumann in mid-leap. Conrad became a symbol, the face of Cold War defection, the embodiment of choosing freedom over communism. But Conrad himself struggled profoundly with his new life. Bavaria was beautiful, prosperous, safe. He found work at an Audi factory working on the assembly line, honest work that paid well by East German standards. The West German government provided some assistance to refugees from the East, helping them integrate into Western society. Conrad had material security in Bavaria that he never could have had in East Germany, but he was desperately, crushingly homesick. The German word is Heimweh, a longing for home that goes deeper than ordinary nostalgia. Conrad missed Saxony, missed the landscapes and dialects and food of his childhood. He missed his parents terribly, knowing they were suffering because of his defection and unable to contact them or help them. He missed Gerda, the girlfriend he had left behind, without even saying goodbye. Bavaria, for all its prosperity, felt foreign to him. The dialect was different. The customs were different. The Catholics of Bavaria were different from the Protestants of Saxony. Conrad felt like a stranger in what was supposedly his own country. West Germans were kind to him, grateful even for his symbolic defection, but they couldn't understand what he had lost or what he was feeling. The fame made everything worse. Conrad couldn't go anywhere without being recognized from the photograph. People would stop him on the street. "You're the guard who jumped," the one from the famous picture. They meant well, but every recognition was a reminder of the single impulsive decision that had torn his life apart. He hadn't jumped to become a symbol, he had jumped in a moment of fear and confusion and instinct. And now he would never be allowed to be anything except the man in that photograph, frozen forever in mid-leap. Conrad tried to build a normal life despite everything. In 1962, he married Kunigunde, a Bavarian woman. They settled in the small town of Gunzenhausen in Bavaria. Conrad continued working at the Audi factory. They had children. By all external measures, Conrad had succeeded in creating a stable, prosperous life in the West. He had escaped communism. He was free. He had opportunities his parents could never have dreamed of. But the depression never lifted. Conrad drank heavily, using alcohol to numb the constant ache of Heimweh. He avoided talking about the jump, avoided interviews, tried to distance himself from the famous photograph. But the photograph had a life of its own. It continued to be published and republished. New generations discovered it. Art critics and historians analyzed it, and Conrad remained trapped by it, unable to escape his own famous image. The years passed. The Cold War continued. The Berlin Wall was reinforced and elaborated, evolving from barbed wire to concrete barrier to the sophisticated system of walls, guard towers, minefields, and death strips that became the permanent face of divided Germany. More than 1,000 other East German border guards defected over the years, following the path Conrad had pioneered. Some of them successfully escaped. Many were shot by their fellow guards. About 140 people died trying to cross the Berlin Wall between 1961 and 1989. Conrad followed these events from Bavaria. Every death at the wall reminded him of the choice he had made. Every successful escape reminded him of his famous jump. He was proud that he had refused to be part of the system that killed those people. But he also felt crushing guilt that his defection had caused suffering for his family and had ultimately done nothing to free anyone else or change the system. His parents eventually died without Conrad ever seeing them again. He couldn't return to East Germany without being arrested as a deserter. They couldn't visit him in the West because the East German government wouldn't grant them exit visas, punishment for having a son who had defected. Conrad missed their funerals. He missed decades of their lives. The jump that had given him freedom had stolen his family. In November 1989, everything changed. The Berlin Wall fell. Suddenly, unexpectedly, after 28 years, the barrier was opened. East Germans poured through checkpoints into West Berlin, celebrating, weeping, embracing West Berliners. The Cold War was ending. Germany would be reunified. The system that Conrad had fled from was collapsing. Conrad watched it happen on television in Bavaria. He felt joy at the wall's fall, relief that the terrible division of Germany was ending. But he also felt a terrible emptiness. His defection had meant nothing. The wall had stood for 28 years after his jump. Hundreds had died. Millions had remained trapped. His single act of rebellion had changed nothing except his own life, and that change had brought more pain than liberation. After reunification in 1990, Conrad could finally visit Saxony again. He returned to Zschopau, to the village where he had grown up. But 30 years had passed. His parents were dead. Many of his childhood friends had moved away or had grown into strangers. The place looked different, felt different. The reunified Germany was building a new future, but Conrad's past was irretrievably lost. He met some old friends who were still in the area. These reunions were awkward, painful. Some people resented Conrad for leaving, others didn't understand why he seemed so unhappy when he had escaped to prosperity in the West. Conrad tried to explain the Heimweh, the decades of loneliness and exile, but the words always seemed inadequate. How do you explain to people who stayed that leaving had been worse than staying, even though staying would have meant living under dictatorship? Conrad also learned what had happened to Gerda, the girlfriend he had left behind in 1961. She had eventually married someone else, had built a life in East Germany. She hadn't waited for Conrad because she had assumed reasonably that she would never see him again. Conrad felt relief that she had found happiness, but also a crushing sense of loss for the life they might have had together. In 1996, 35 years after the famous photograph was taken, Conrad agreed to meet Peter Leibing, the photographer who had captured his leap. It was the first time they had spoken since that day in 1961. Leibing had built a successful career in photography, and that single image of Conrad remained his most famous work. The two men met in Berlin, near the site where the jump had occurred. The wall was gone now, reduced to scattered memorial sections. Bernauer Strasse was being rebuilt, reunified Berlin, trying to heal the scar that had divided it for decades. The meeting was emotional and complicated. Leibing thanked Conrad for the image, acknowledging that the photograph had made his career. Conrad didn't seem to know how to respond. The photograph had defined Conrad's life in ways that Leibing, despite his best intentions, couldn't fully understand. Leibing had captured a moment. Conrad had lived with the consequences of that moment every day for 35 years. They talked about what had happened to both of them in the decades since 1961. Leibing's career, Conrad's struggles, the strange fate of becoming famous for a single, split-second decision. They parted cordially, but the meeting couldn't bridge the fundamental gulf between them. One had documented history, the other had been consumed by it. By the late 1990s, Conrad's depression had become overwhelming. The reunification of Germany had not brought him peace. If anything, it had made things worse by removing even the political justification for his suffering. When Germany was divided, Conrad could tell himself that his defection had been necessary, that he had been right to flee tyranny. But now that Germany was reunified, what had been the point of his 37 years of exile? He could have stayed, endured the GDR, and eventually lived to see freedom come to all of Germany. Instead, he had jumped, had abandoned his family, had spent decades in isolation and regret, and history had moved on without him. He started talking about feeling like he had always been a deserter, that his life had been defined by that single act of desertion, and he had never stopped running, never found a place where he truly belonged. Bavaria was not home. Saxony was no longer home. He existed between worlds, belonging to neither. On June 20th, 1998, Conrad Schumann walked into his orchard in Kipfenberg, Bavaria. It was early morning. His wife was in the house. Conrad tied a rope to a tree branch, and he hanged himself. His suicide shocked those who knew him and devastated the broader community of people who had admired his famous defection. The man who had become a symbol of freedom had killed himself. The jump that was supposed to represent liberation from communist oppression had led to a lifetime of depression and a death by suicide. What did that say about freedom? What did it say about the cost of defection? What did it say about the photograph that had made him famous? Peter Leibing, the photographer, was profoundly affected by Conrad's death. He had always viewed the photograph with pride, seeing it as documenting a heroic moment. Now he was forced to confront the terrible burden that photograph had placed on Conrad. In interviews after Conrad's suicide, Leibing acknowledged that while the image had made his career, it had haunted Conrad for his entire life. Conrad had never been able to be anything except the man in that photograph, frozen forever in that moment of decision. The funeral was held in Bavaria. Conrad was buried in Kipfenberg, far from Saxony, in the land where he had spent most of his adult life, but had never truly felt at home. A memorial plaque was later installed near the site in Berlin where Conrad had made his famous jump, commemorating his defection. But that memorial, like the photograph, could only capture the moment, not the decades of suffering that followed. Conrad Schumann's story raises uncomfortable questions about defection, exile, and the price of freedom. He is celebrated in history as a hero who chose the West over communist tyranny. The famous photograph is used constantly in documentaries and textbooks about the Cold War. Leap into Freedom remains one of the most powerful images of that era. But Conrad himself never experienced that leap as freedom. He experienced it as the beginning of a 37-year exile that ended in suicide. He lost his family, his homeland, his girlfriend, his sense of identity and belonging. Yes, he gained material prosperity and political freedom in West Germany, but those gains could not compensate for what he had lost. His story reveals the complexity of defection that Cold War propaganda often obscured. The West celebrated defectors as heroes choosing freedom. The East condemned them as traitors. But the actual human experience of defection was more complicated than either narrative acknowledged. Defectors lost everything familiar and were expected to be grateful for their freedom. They were turned into symbols and expected to perform gratitude for their escape from communism. But symbols are not people, and the actual emotional and psychological costs of exile are not erased by material prosperity or political liberty. Conrad was one of approximately 5,000 East German border guards who defected during the existence of the German Democratic Republic. Each of them faced similar struggles, similar losses, but Conrad's fame from the photograph made his experience particularly difficult. Other defectors could eventually achieve anonymity, could rebuild lives without constant reminders of what they had left behind. Conrad could never do that. The photograph followed him everywhere, a permanent reminder of the worst decision he ever made, and he had come to see it as the worst decision. In the final years of his life, Conrad told friends that he regretted the jump, not because he believed in communism or wanted to live under dictatorship, but because the cost of that single impulsive moment had been so enormous that no amount of political freedom could justify it. He had destroyed his relationship with his parents. He had lost his girlfriend. He had spent his entire adult life feeling like a stranger in his own country. The jump had given him material comfort but had taken his soul. Mental health professionals who later studied Conrad's case identified his condition as a severe and chronic case of Heimweh compounded by survivor guilt and identity crisis. He mourned the life he might have lived in East Germany, even while intellectually knowing that life would have been constrained by dictatorship. He felt guilt that his defection had harmed his family while helping no one else. And he couldn't construct a coherent identity for himself because he was always and forever the guard who jumped, defined entirely by a single moment at age 19. The tragedy of Conrad Schumann is that both his jump and his suicide made sense within the logic of his experience. At 19, standing at that border in the August heat, watching West Berliners beckoning to him, aware of the officers watching him, Conrad had faced an impossible choice in an impossible moment. His decision to jump was understandable, even brave, but that decision trapped him in consequences he couldn't have foreseen and couldn't escape. And 37 years later, worn down by decades of Heimweh and depression and the crushing weight of symbolic fame he had never sought, his decision to end his life also made sense within the logic of his suffering. After Conrad's death, there were calls to reconsider how defectors are remembered and celebrated. Some German intellectuals argued that the Cold War propaganda of both sides had done terrible damage to actual human beings caught between systems. The West's celebration of defectors as freedom heroes erased their actual suffering. The East's condemnation of them as traitors ignored the legitimate reasons people fled dictatorship. And the individuals themselves were crushed between these competing narratives, unable to be fully human, always either heroes or villains rather than just people trying to survive impossible circumstances. Peter Leibing kept the photograph in his archive but stopped promoting it after Conrad's suicide. When asked about the image in later interviews, Leibing would acknowledge its historical importance but also emphasize the human cost it represented. He died in 2008, carrying with him the complicated legacy of having captured one of the 20th century's most iconic images and witnessing the terrible price the subject of that image had paid for his moment of fame. The site in Berlin where Conrad jumped is now marked by a memorial. A section of the Berlin Wall is preserved there as part of the Berlin Wall Memorial Complex. Tourists visit constantly, taking photographs, learning about the history of divided Berlin. Many of them see the memorial to Conrad Schumann and learn about his famous defection. Most of them do not learn that he killed himself 37 years later, unable to bear the weight of what that defection had cost him. In Kipfenberg, Bavaria, Conrad's grave is maintained by family members. It's a simple grave, not particularly marked or notable. Occasionally, people who know his story make pilgrimages there, paying respects to the man behind the photograph. But mostly, Conrad Schumann rests in quiet obscurity, finally anonymous, finally free from the fame that had haunted him for most of his adult life. His story endures as a reminder that historical symbols are created from human lives, and those lives are always more complicated than the symbols they become. Conrad Schumann made one decision on one afternoon in August 1961. That decision was photographed, publicized, celebrated, and turned into a symbol of freedom. But Conrad himself never felt free. He felt exiled, lost, caught between worlds, defined by a moment he couldn't escape. The photograph remains. It hangs in museums and appears in textbooks. It's powerful, moving, historically significant. A young man in mid-leap over barbed wire choosing freedom, defying tyranny. That's the story the photograph tells, but the photograph cannot tell the story of what came after. The decades of loneliness, the crushing homesickness, the impossible loss, the family destroyed, the identity shattered, the depression that deepened year after year until it became unbearable. The orchard in Bavaria where Conrad finally decided he could not continue. These are not in the photograph, but they are inseparable from it. Hans Conrad Schumann, born March 28, 1942, died June 20th, 1998. He lived 56 years, 37 of them defined by a single leap that lasted seconds. He became a symbol of freedom, but never felt free. He escaped communist dictatorship but could not escape the prison of his own exile. And in the end, the leap into freedom became the beginning of a long, slow falling that ended in a Bavarian orchard on a summer morning when even living one more day seemed impossible. The Berlin Wall is gone now, reduced to memorial fragments. The Cold War ended. Germany was reunified. The system Conrad fled from collapsed, and Conrad Schumann is dead by his own hand, buried in Bavaria, forever the man in the photograph, forever jumping, forever caught between East and West, between tyranny and freedom, between the life he left and the life he never quite managed to build.